Okay, in the first video here for Chapter 6, we're going to just take a look at the basic form itself, and in the other videos we'll get into the actual controls and some other items. You run into forms a lot. Almost every time you want to collect information from a visitor, you're going to use a form. This is the biggest way that we get information from the user, and as a developer, most of your work is going to be surrounded around forms of one sort or another, not all the time, but a large majority of the time. In this particular page, the form has a simple text box where you can put something into it or enter information, and on Google's page it has two different buttons that actually submit the form. By submitting the form, I'm talking about it actually going to the server itself. There are many other forms out there that are more complicated than just a simple Google form. In this particular example, there are several select boxes, such as this one. You have another one here, another one here. You have three of them here. These are where you click the box or the button on the right hand side, such as right here, and it gives you a list of values that you can actually select from then. You also have radio buttons that are used, some examples of them here, whereby you can choose one or the other. It's either yes or no. You can't click both of them at the same time. This actually has three sets of radio buttons, each one of them being yes and no. So you can either click yes or no, but you can't click both of them at the same time. If you click yes and then go back and click no, then the yes becomes unclicked. You also see at the bottom of this form check boxes. These are things that are used to give users a choice of things, and unlike the radio buttons, all three of these could be checked if that's what you wanted. You could either click them all or leave them all unclicked. And then there's text inputs as well. See a couple of them here. One, it's using it for birth dates, and we have another one down here for the vehicle registration number, where the user can actually enter data in there. So in our second video, we'll actually look at all these various controls that you can place on a form. Any form that you create actually is inside of a form element. And the form controls, the input boxes, text boxes, drop-down boxes, check box, all the things that we just talked about, as well as numerous other ones, then reside in between the opening and closing form tag. A form can actually have other HTML inside of it as well. After users enter information in the form, they usually have to click some type of submit button. It probably doesn't say submit, as you saw with the Google page. It says Google search or I'm feeling lucky. So it doesn't necessarily say submit, but it's a submit button nonetheless. On traditional web pages, after the data arrives at the server, there's a script or other program that would actually process the data and send a new web page back to you. That's all handled on the server, and we'll touch a little bit on that, but that's beyond the scope of what we're doing here. So if we look at a very basic form, you can see that we have an opening and a closing form tag. We have some plain HTML in the form of the H3, and then we also have two inputs, which are the controls. This just has a simple text box and a submit button. When we run it, you can see then that here's our H3 and then the text box and submit button that we had in here. When a browser actually sends data to the server, it's transmitted in name-value pairs. The name actually coincides or responds to the name of the form control. So in the text box here, it has a name of txt search item. We could give a name for the submit button as well if we wanted to, but we're not submitting that for anything at this point, so we don't have to have it there. But we do have to have a name for the text box. The value then is what is entered into that, and then we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk specifically about the text box. But everything goes in a name value pair. The form itself carries a couple attributes that we'll talk about in more detail in just a few minutes, but the action and the method. The action is what page is going to process this on the server. The method is how we're going to actually send that information to the server. And we'll look at those a little bit closer here in just a few moments as well. So the form, as I said, actually lives inside of the form element. It can also contain, as you saw, other markups such as paragraphs, headings, which we saw, and so on. The one thing it can't have is it may not contain another form. Remember, in tables, we nested tables within a table. You cannot nest a form within a form. You can have multiple forms on the same page, you just can't nest them inside of each other. The form carries all the universal attributes as well as the additional attributes that you see listed in the bottom of the page here, and we will look at each one of these individually. The action attribute. As I said before, this indicates what's going to happen to the data when the form is submitted. It's usually the name of the page or program on the web server that receives the information and then processes that information. The method attribute has one of two values. It either has a get value or a post value. And this is the way that the information is actually sent to the server. With the get method, where method equals get, it sends the data as part of the URL. You would actually see it in the URL as it was being sent. All the name value pairs would appear. The post method, method equals post, hides the data in the HTTP headers. So it sends all the name value pairs within the header itself and they're not exposed through the URL. These two methods also require different objects on the server to actually process it. And again, that is beyond the scope of what we're going to look at here. You would be getting that in any ASP.NET, PHP, or ASP class that you might take. The ID attribute enables you to uniquely identify the form element within the page. Again, you could have multiple forms. So it's a good practice to give every form element an ID attribute. Many forms make use of style sheets and scripts that would require the ID element in order to identify the form that it's going to act on, the style sheet or the script. In our class, you start the value of the ID and name attributes for forms with a prefix of FRM, so that we know that it's referring to a form. The rest of the value would be something that would describe it in some way, like form login or form search. The name attribute, as you should already know, is the predecessor to the ID attribute, and the value should be unique to the document, just like with the ID. It's actually optional for the form itself, but when you do use it, most people give it the same value as the ID attribute. Others give it a totally different name. So it can be the same or it can be different, but it's optional to start with. The encryption type attribute. You would use this attribute to specify how the browser encodes the data before it's sent to the server. And there's three basic types of encoding that you can do. The application / XWWW form URL encoded is the standard method that most forms use. Browsers use this because some characters such as spaces, the plus sign, and some other non-alphanumeric characters cannot be sent to the web server. Instead, they are replaced by other characters that are used to represent them. And indeed, we only need to look as far as Blackboard to actually see some examples of this. I just went out to the home page for this class, and in the URL you'll see several %2f. See one there, here's one here, there's another one here, and so on. So there's several of them there. These were actually originally spaces that were replaced by the %2f. The percent is sort of like a character entity where we use the ampersand, but in a URL the percent says, hey, what follows this is a hexadecimal value of the character that should be here. So it's basically the ASCII value of the character, in this case a space, represented in hexadecimal value 2f, and the percent sign just tells the browser, hey, this is a hexadecimal value for the ASCII. So there's some examples of how, or an example of how that's done. The multi-part / form data enables the data to be sent in parts, where each consecutive part corresponds to a form control in the order it appears in the form. This is commonly used when visitors need to upload files to the server. Each part can have an optional content type header of its own indicating the type of data for that form control. And then the last one is plain text, which sends the data to the server as unmodified plain text. If this attribute is not used, browsers use the first value, the application / so on. The most likely time that you're actually going to even use this would be if you're allowing a file to be uploaded. In that case, the encrypt type attribute should be given the second value, which is the multi-part / form data. So that would be used for any uploads. The accept character set attribute, different languages are written in different character sets or groups of characters. So when you create your website, you do not always build them to understand all the different languages. Here in the US, everything's built to understand English basically and nothing else. You are starting to see some now representing Spanish, but for the most part they're English language. The idea behind the accept character set attribute is that it specifies a list of character encodings that a user may enter and that the server can then process. The values should be space separated or a comma delimited list of character sets, and you can find them in Appendix E. As an example of that, for United States English, the accept character set would be equal to UTF-8. If no accept character set attribute is set, any character set is valid. The noValidate attribute is a boolean that indicates whether the form should be validated when submitted. If it's present, the browser should not validate the form prior to submission. As developers, you will not be using this very much at all, if ever, because you're going to want to validate the information that you get from the user to make sure that the code page on the server that's going to process it has the correct data. In other words, you want to make sure that if it requires a number is actually submitted. If it requires something to be entered, you want to make sure that something is actually there. So you won't see that used very often. The target attribute would specify a named window or a keyword for processing the form. The most popular one you're going to run into is _blank. That's going to open up in a new window or a new tab as the browsers are done now. Self is the default. So if you don't use the target, it's going to open up in the same window that the page you're looking at or that contains the link is open in. Parent displays it in the parent frame. Top is displayed in the full body of the window, and then the frame name. We looked about iframes. You would give the iframe a name, and you could then tell the browser that, hey, this target is this page or this window. Actually name it, and it'll open up in that. Now, my rule of thumb that I expect you to follow is that any link to an outside web page should be open in a new tab or a new window. So the target should be equal to underscore blank. My reasoning for that is that if you go to another website, I want to keep my client's website still open, so that if they go off somewhere else after they go to that new page in another website, they can always very quickly click on the tab that takes them right back to where they started on my client's website. If it's a page within my client's website, I just use the default, which is self. So it just opens up in the same window. The autocomplete indicates whether or not the browser should autofill form values. Setting it to off indicates that the browser should not autofill any values, and by default it's on. So if it recognizes the value that you're starting to enter, and it's usually because it's been entered before, then it'll go ahead and show you the values that you can choose from or the value that you used the last time. So that's the bare basics of the form itself. In the next video, we're going to take a look at all the controls that you can place on the form or in the form.